The story begins with the image of a man, an engineer working on a lift truck, trying to complete his task of running electrical lines. He was a true atheist, not believing in any religion or supernatural existence. To him, life was merely numbers and physical laws, with no room for the existence of God or any spiritual belief. He was accustomed to solving problems with logic and often dismissed what others called faith or supernatural powers. That day, he and his colleague were working at a height, running electrical lines across power poles. To save time, they decided not to lower the lift truck for each adjustment, opting instead to finish the job in one go. While his colleague was operating the truck, he was so focused on avoiding electrocution that he failed to notice the branches around them, accidentally bumping into a large tree. In an instant, the truck jolted violently, and the man standing on the platform was thrown to the side. His body slammed hard against the frame of the truck, causing him excruciating pain. He could hear the sound of his ribs cracking. At that moment, he couldn't fully grasp the severity of the accident, but he knew something was wrong. All he could do was endure the pain and wait for help. After being rushed to the hospital by his colleague, the doctors informed him that his condition was critical. His right ribs were broken, and there was a risk of internal organ damage. Despite receiving treatment, the injuries did not heal as expected. He had to stay in the emergency room, waiting to see if the medical interventions would work. As time passed, his body grew weaker. Pain and shortness of breath started to consume him entirely. He sat on the hospital bed, looking around the cold emergency room, feeling completely isolated from the outside world. Everything seemed overwhelming, but growing up in the tough environment of the South Bronx, he had learned to face challenges on his own. "I can handle this," he thought. "I don't need anyone's help." But after 45 minutes of struggling to breathe, he realized he couldn't endure it any longer. When he finally pressed the nurse call button, things began to happen quickly. The medical staff rushed in, and upon seeing him, the nurse immediately triggered the emergency alarm. He had no idea what was happening, but he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. A silent panic spread throughout the room. This marked the beginning of his near-death experience. The first emotion he remembered when everyone stormed into the room was not fear but shame. He felt ashamed because he had been stripped down so quickly, leaving him with no privacy or dignity. He felt as though his autonomy had been taken away, and this overwhelmed him with a sense of shame, which overpowered all other emotions. After overcoming the shame, he began thinking about other things. He thought about his family. What would happen to them if he didn't make it? Could they go on without him? The thoughts of his family and responsibilities weighed heavily on his mind, filling him with an indescribable anxiety. While he was pondering these things, a strange feeling arose within him. For the first time in his life, he started thinking about God. He silently prayed in his mind, "If there is a God, if you help me get through this, I will change. I'll become a better person, live a better life." But nothing happened. God didn't respond to his prayer, and this made him angry. He thought, "I knew it. God doesn't exist. It's all just nothing." The anger surged within him, but it didn't last long before it was replaced by another emotion, a deep, profound fear. He thought about death, and with his atheistic beliefs, he was convinced that after death, there would be nothing. He would be like a light bulb that switched off, disappearing into oblivion without a trace. The fear of fading into non-existence, without any form of life after death, made him feel colder and lonelier than ever. At that moment, all he wanted was for someone to hold his hand, to offer him comfort in his final moments. But then he remembered his father. His father had taught him that men must be strong, never showing weakness or asking for help. "I have to be strong," he told himself. "I can't let my father down." And so he steeled himself, preparing to face death alone. In that moment, he heard the steady drip of water from the IV system. The sound was like rain falling on a rooftop, regular and quiet. He looked up at the wall and felt as if his vision had become sharper than ever. He could see the fine grain on the wallpaper, and a strange sense of wonder began to grow inside him, both curiosity and fear. He realized that he was slowly dying, but instead of panicking, he felt a strange calm. He saw a shadow standing by the door. It didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for something. That was when he realized that perhaps it was time to let go. His life had been so hard and exhausting, and maybe there was no shame in surrendering, allowing things to unfold naturally. It's not giving up, he thought. It's just that I can't change anything anymore. And when he accepted that, the shadow began to move, approaching him and gently touching his toe. The moment the shadow touched him, he felt a miraculous release. The pain disappeared, replaced by a sense of relaxation, peace, love, and warmth that filled his entire body. He no longer had to struggle with pain or shortness of breath. A warm breeze blew over him, bringing with it a soothing and tranquil feeling, as if he were standing in a vast, open field with no worries or fears. After the feeling of relaxation filled his body, he noticed that he was gradually drifting out of the hospital room. This light sensation was completely different from the pain he had just experienced. He no longer felt his body. Instead, there was a sense of weightlessness. Everything around him seemed to slow down, and he felt himself being slowly lifted. When his awareness returned, he found himself standing in a corner of the room, looking down at his own body on the hospital bed. Doctors and nurses were frantically working to save him. One doctor was performing CPR, her face tense and filled with worry. She bent over him, tirelessly compressing his chest, trying to keep him alive. He looked closely at his body and realized that it was him. The lifeless figure on the hospital bed was indeed his own. But at the same time, a strange question arose in his mind. If that's me, then who am I now? Where am I? At that moment, a voice spoke next to him. Though there was no form, the sound of the voice made him feel a presence. The voice told him to think of his body as a car. That car has traveled 5 million miles, and there's no way to repair it anymore. The voice continued, now you must say goodbye to your body. He breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this voice. So I've accepted death, he thought. Suddenly, he felt an unprecedented gratitude for his body. Although he had never truly appreciated it before, in this moment, he realized that his body had given him the opportunity to live, had endured all the challenges and hardships so that he could exist. He realized that we often focus only on our flaws, on the things that are imperfect about ourselves, and rarely take the time to be thankful for the good things we have. As these thoughts flowed through his mind, small memories started to flood back. Daily memories, things that seemed ordinary and mundane. Someone's smile, the small hand of his younger brother as he held it tightly, a kiss from his mother, the loving gaze of his children. These moments suddenly became more precious than ever before. Even the simple act of taking a breath now felt like a miracle. In that moment, the voice spoke again, telling him that it was time to continue the journey. He felt the presence of a mysterious figure, not clear who or what it was, but it felt feminine, gentle, and caring. He couldn't see a distinct form, but the presence brought him peace. The figure guided him through a strange space. He stepped into a vast void, with a gigantic black hole appearing before him. They walked straight into it, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, he felt a sharp pain. It was as if something was being torn from him. He kept falling, endlessly, with no end in sight. This sensation lasted for what seemed like an eternity, until he thought he would never reach the bottom. But eventually he landed, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. But the mysterious figure didn't let him pause for long. You must keep going, the voice urged him once again. This time he plunged into another black hole. the sensation of being torn apart persisted, but with each descent, the negative emotions, anxieties, and fears gradually faded away. The things that had weighed heavily on his mind and soul were being stripped away, little by little, as though he was being cleansed, growing lighter after each fall. Finally, he hit the bottom again, but this time the first thing he saw wasn't darkness, but a mass of vibrant, powerful color. This color wasn't just a color. It was alive, continuously moving and full of life. It seemed to be communicating with him, like millions of voices speaking at once, leaving him confused and unable to fully grasp their meaning. Yet deep within, he sensed an inexplicable understanding, even though he couldn't quite articulate it. As the mass of color opened up, he stood before an awe-inspiring scene. A vast forest stretched out before him, with towering mountains and the dark shadows of clouds cast over the slopes. The wild landscape, with herds of animals running across it, was full of vitality and strength. He realized that he was hovering, floating over this breathtaking scenery. "I'm flying," he thought to himself, and immediately the voice responded, "That's normal here." Amidst the majestic nature, he remembered his children. This was the only part of the journey that brought him any pain. What will happen to the kids? He worried. But the voice gently reassured him. Don't worry, you can see them from here. Those words brought him an indescribable sense of peace. That's amazing, he exclaimed. All his fears about being separated from his children vanished, and he continued his journey with a sense of calm and love. He soared over the mountains, through the dense forests, feeling as though he had become one with the surrounding environment. The deep sense of love and tranquility seeped into every corner of his soul. This wasn't just a spiritual journey. It was a journey of connection with nature, with emotions he had never fully experienced before. While flying over the majestic natural landscape, his eyes suddenly focused on an emerald-green body of water, where a long, beautiful beach stretched out. In the crystal-clear water, he saw a man standing at the water's edge, with water reaching just his knees. What caught his attention even more were 6 children, holding tightly to the man's right hand, lined up in a row, with another child holding his left hand. He was captivated by the strange scene, unable to resist the curiosity that drew him closer to see who this was and what was happening. He gently lowered his altitude, coming closer and stopping just a few steps away. At that moment, the man slowly turned around. When he saw the man's face, he was stunned. It was his father. A surge of surprise and emotion welled up inside him. His father had passed away a long time ago, and they had never had a good relationship while he was alive. His father had been strict and rigid, always keeping a cold distance from his children. In fact, he couldn't even remember the last time they exchanged words of affection. His father often drank, leading to frequent arguments and conflicts between the two. Although he was the 7th of 8 children, he always felt responsible for protecting his mother from his father's abuse. For a long time, he had considered the relationship between him and his father as a deep wound in his heart, a sadness he thought he could never resolve. But now here was his father in front of him, no longer stern or rigid. Instead, his face showed a serene, kind expression, as if all the sorrow and burdens had been lifted. His emotions became conflicted. This was the opportunity he never had in real life, the chance to say the things he had never said. Throughout their lives, they had never hugged, never said, "I love you." But now he felt that this was the moment they could mend all that had been lost. He stepped closer to his father, filled with emotion. No words were needed. Through their eyes and presence alone, they exchanged the deepest feelings that neither had ever expressed. It wasn't about apologies or regret. It was about understanding and unconditional forgiveness. He felt a strong spiritual connection, a harmony between them that had never existed before. They not only reunited but became one, with no distance or separation between father and son. After this emotional reunion, his father looked at him gently and said, "You have to go back." The words shocked him. "I don't think so," he replied. "I really like it here." In his heart, at that moment, everything here felt perfect. The peace, the miraculous beauty beyond anything he had ever imagined. But his father shook his head and smiled softly. "No, it's not your time yet," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He felt torn. Part of him wanted to stay, to merge with all the wonderful things around him. But then he felt a strong pull from behind, as though something within his body was dragging him back. He fought to stay, but the force grew stronger, and he could no longer resist. Just as he felt himself being fully pulled back, he saw his father again. His father continued, "You don't understand. You have to go back." But to reassure him, his father made a promise. "Listen, when your time comes, I will come and get you. I promise I will do that." A sense of relief washed over him. Wow, what an amazing promise, he thought. How could he refuse that? So he agreed. He felt comforted by his father's promise, and finally he allowed himself to return. When he awoke, he found himself back in his body. The doctors who had been trying to save him earlier were all astonished when they saw him open his eyes. One of the doctors performing CPR stepped back a little in surprise, staring at him with wide eyes. But in just a moment, he felt himself leaving his body again and returning to his father, in that wondrous space. This time, his father didn't have much time left. He said, "You really don't understand. You have to go back." Although he wanted to stay, he felt the pull growing even stronger. This time there was no chance to resist. His father added, "We made a deal, remember? When your time comes, I will come and get you. But for now, you must return." He began to feel himself being pulled forcefully, and there was no way to fight against it. He realized that he had to return to the real world, but the only consolation was his father's promise. A promise that when the time came, he wouldn't have to go through this alone again. When he returned to his body once more, he felt the clear distinction between the spiritual world and the real world. This separation was so profound that he almost felt disconnected from everything around him. Yet, he felt deeply comforted by the experiences he had just been through. He knew that, even though this world was full of loneliness and fear, everything was working toward a greater purpose, one far beyond human understanding. A sense of peace and calm filled his soul. Even though he had returned to the real world, he carried with him a deep connection to the universe and everything around him. And he knew that when his time came, he wouldn't have to worry or be afraid anymore, because his father had promised to bring him back, so they could reunite once again, forever.